Good afternoon, all. Thanks for joining. My name is Mark Turner. I look after the Waste and Resource Use Group in the Supply Chain Sustainability School. So that's a group of the partners who have a particular focus around the area of waste and resource efficiency. And I'm going to be taking you through this short webinar. We've got space for a few questions in the webinar as well, so you can use the chat box for that. I intend to talk for half an hour or so, depending on how things go, and any questions that come along the way. And then we're going to wrap up for 1:45, hopefully no later than that, to get everybody on their way. So, I mean, just to start off, I will say, here's an overview of what we're going to cover. We're going to look at some of the legislation. This will only be a very quick whistle-stop tour through the legislation. And I would strongly advise that you look at some of the school learning resources if you wish to know any more, in particular the e-learning modules. And we have 2 learning pathways, which I'll mention again. I'm going to talk about some of the financial implications of waste and inefficient resource use, and see if we can get a bit of a focus going on that. And then I'll round off with just a brief resume on waste management planning and how effective waste management planning can be very useful in terms of driving down your costs and improving your resource efficiency performance. Okay, by the end of the session, I'm hoping that you'll have at least revisited some of the legal responsibilities you or your organisation has under waste legislation. Again, I say we won't go into this in huge depth, but there'll be enough there for you to take away and use later on in terms of seeking out any information that you need. Hopefully you'll have had an opportunity to consider some ways, or start considering ways, to improve site waste management around your own sites and those of your clients. And lastly, quite an important one, just be better placed to explain what the requirements are to other people whose day job it isn't, or who need to know, and you need to impart the information to them. And we can take that forward. This is actually being recorded, this session, so it can be provided to others at the end, and therefore all the content will be available. Okay, right. Although kind of mics and cameras and all of that are switched off in terms of you, the audience, what I can say is I'd really like you to participate. So if you've got questions, put them in the chat box and they'll come through. And I will endeavour to read those while I'm presenting at the same time. And we'll answer what we can in the time available. But the other thing we're going to do to make it a little bit more interactive is we've got just a couple of what we call Menti polls. There's something called Mentimeter, which is an app that you can use online to set polls and set and answer questions. And I'll give you a bit more detail on that in a minute. As I said, you will get the slides afterwards. Okay, lastly, but not least, we're very reliant on your feedback to make these events better. So there will be a link shared to the feedback. Please take a bit of time to fill some in, because although we've been running online stuff now through the school for well over 11 months, we're still learning every day as to how to make that work. Okay, right. We're going to use Mentimeter, as I mentioned. You might want to set this up now so you've got it ready. Best way, you can either stick it in your phone. You can open a separate browser on the computer, but try not to switch me off when you do that, because that's very disheartening. Somewhat disappointing when people drop off because they're switching onto the Menti. But you can use your phone or a separate browser on your computer, and you put in www.menti.com and just add in the code at the top. That's 5928664. We're going to be using the same code throughout. So you'll need to see this screen that we're on, so don't leave Click Meeting, as I mentioned before. Okay, right, we'll make a start. First of all, let's start with the definition. So what is waste? Well, from the Waste Framework Directive, which is something that has been, I suppose, left behind with us in terms of Britain's membership of the EU, we can have the definition that says any substance or object that the holder discards or intends to, or is required to discard. And that's kind of key thing there, because you can see the word discard coming out. That suggests that waste is something not worth having. It's being discarded. Obviously, we're going to talk quite a bit around the resource efficiency side of things this afternoon, and hopefully that's principle of just finding ways to discard things will move a bit lower down your personal hierarchy and the organisational hierarchy. So now we're going to move to our first poll question before we even start. And the reason why I'm moving to this is because it's very, very important to think about stakeholders when you think about any issue in sustainability, and waste and resource efficiency is no different. So who are the stakeholders? Which individuals, organisations, whoever they are interested in resource efficiency and the legal and effective management of waste? Who cares about this topic? So what I'd ask you to do is go on and just type in, and here it comes, and it's starting to drop in. So this is good. So think in the round about who could join in. Yeah, waste contractors, very interested, no doubt. The client is interested, are they not, in the waste that gets generated, because it will have a cost to it. So they'll be looking at ways to reduce and for you to be more resource efficient. Government is a key one. We'll touch on the government issue, because obviously it's very, very clear that some major announcements have probably been somewhat delayed by the whole process of the last year, the kind of journey through COVID that we're having, which has been a bumpy ride, as we know. So there are significant announcements to be made around waste and resource efficiency, and we'll see those starting to flow, I believe, this year. But we've got other ones on this chart here, so we can see the local community mentioned. It's a real critical issue, certainly in terms of nuisance, but also, the nuisance that waste can cause, but also the opportunity to get involved in waste management around the local community. Are there voluntary sector organisations that could come in? Producers of products, those who produce products, will be thinking about how they can reduce waste, packaging being a key example. You've got your client there. We've got the environmental regulators. This is moving all the time, but I think we can see who the big ones are. So clients coming through very strongly, suppliers coming through very strongly. Yeah, I think that sets the tone. So let's kind of bear that in mind and move back to the questions. So we've done that one. Just in terms, I mentioned our own school waste and resource use group. These are the intervention points that we look at. So if you think about this as a continuum, and you come on the left-hand side, you can see the clients mentioned and the designer. So if you can design out waste from the start, you will have the best possible effect. We all know that the earliest possible engagement is the best way to kind of kick in. I see a comment in the chat just that health and safety becomes a key issue around waste as well. And that's very, very true. So there's significant effects around health and safety in a positive sense if waste is managed and resources are managed more effectively, and less so if they're managed ineffectively. But back to the continuum, you've got the client, you've got the designer, and then you go into the contractor or FM service provider, whoever it happens to be, the subcontractors and suppliers that feed into that process. All of these organisations and the individuals within them have a say or an impact on what happens in terms of waste. Once a building is constructed, it moves into an FM phase, it's operated. Most buildings are here already. So a very, very significant impact around the management of the existing build environment. And that's important to consider. And then end of life, you get into the demolition and deconstruction and demobilisation side of things. And that brings in some very significant waste aspects. And all along, a continuous link to something called the circular economy, which you can see mentioned there before, down below. And I will touch on that a bit more as we go. Okay, just around the legislation, this is a whistle-stop tour through the legislation, roughly divides into three. So you can think of inert waste, which is non-biodegradable material. It's not going to biodegrade in the ground, in landfill, or even above ground when it's sitting there. So you could include within that non-contaminated subsoil, aggregates, those sorts of things that are very, very much associated with construction sites. Then into non-hazardous waste, and there are some examples mentioned there, and you might say some of those are contentious, but you're talking here about non-contaminated materials, but materials that are in fact biodegradable. So you've got some topsoils, you've got timber, metal, plastics. And then you go into the hazardous side of waste, and you've got all the contaminated material and potentially harmful materials that are out there. So oils, paints, all the kind of organic liquids, solvents, those sides of things. In terms of the main waste legislation, I'll just kind of walk you through a little bit of a journey through time. And if we start with the Environmental Protection Act, it's kind of a key one really, because in terms of the Environmental Protection Act, it was the first time when the phraseology moving from waste disposal to waste management came in. So the idea that you're actually going to manage this stuff as a material rather than just dispose of it as something you don't want anymore. And that's interesting in its own right. Then you can go across to the Waste England and Wales Regulations 2011, and that was the first time when the waste hierarchy came into activity. And the waste hierarchy is critical because it gives us a way of considering ways in which we can manage our material more effectively, our waste material more effectively. And it's an obligation, a legal obligation, that you consider the waste hierarchy in terms of how you do manage your waste on site, as we'll come to. And then in terms of environmental permitting, the England and Wales environmental permitting regulations, so you've there got permits and exemptions, and those of you that are familiar around sites will be kind of very familiar with the concept around permits and exemptions and how critical they can be to effective waste management, especially when you're using large volumes. So I noticed there's a question about topsoils and inert subsoils, so that could relate to as an example, an exemptions issue, and where you're seeking the right kind of permit. So you're determining what the material is and it's how it will then be treated henceforth. Just a bit more, we've got hazardous waste regulations. Now, only in Wales do you register premises, but we all have to work in terms of our management of hazardous waste with obviously the consignment notes that are involved there. And then across to the waste and electrical equipment regulations, which is a heck of a mouthful, but most people call them the WE regs. And this relates to the collection, treatment, recycling and recovery of waste electrical equipment. Now, that's become quite a thing, obviously. We've since I suppose even since the outset in 2010 of the WE regs, we see far more engagement into this area. And consideration of the resources that are going into them, which are often quite scarce resources. There might be scarce materials, rare earths, all those rare earth metals. So you're actually talking, moving into kind of the whole area of considering waste as a resource when you consider in that area, let alone the hazard issues and let alone the issues around plastics. And then the producer responsibility obligations, so the packaging regs, as they're often called, about the obligation where you generate over a certain tonnage to recover and recycle and record very accurately waste packaging. And that last one, just before I kind of move on, kicks into something that's coming in within a year's time, which is the plastic packaging tax. So you'll see another kind of move on in that context. I'll try and talk about that as we go. Okay, just moving on to the EPA, the Environmental Protection Act. So there is a duty of care, and this duty of care is kind of a critical issue where you can see that it's broken into 4 areas of the producer. So the producer being the company or the individual that's produced the waste. And the obligation of the producer is to check the licenses, the permits, the exemptions. The consigner is the employee within that organization. So that's the individual who is going to hand over that material, that waste material, with the appropriate waste transfer note or hazardous waste consignment note. That duty of care is maintained. Then you get to the carrier, and you're looking for licensed carriers. So it's very, very important to check and check and recheck the waste carrier's license. The waste carrier is going to move the waste from one place to another. Now, they might not move it to its final destination. They might move it to a processing plant. That's quite likely. So it's very, very important also to recognise that in terms of waste, the movement of waste when it's broken down to component level is very, very complex these days. It's a global market, and hence the importance of the duty of care in understanding that you have enacted your duty of care all the way down through to that point, to the consignee. Okay, let's move on. As I said, we're not spending a lot of time on this, but it's just a bit of a resume over it. So all I'll say on that slide is you or your organization can be fined, but the fine isn't really the issue. The issue is the reputational damage that comes with it. That can be absolutely significant, and more significant than the fine itself. And it is not an area where organisations want to be. These things are most certainly checked throughout the supply chain at all levels. And with the power of Google and with the power of search engines these days, it's very, very possible to work out whether an organisation is telling the truth or not about their clean environmental record. Okay, next. Right, we're now on to the waste hierarchy. And as I say, it's an obligation to observe the waste hierarchy and consider the waste hierarchy in terms of your treatment of waste. So what I'd like you to do here as an exercise is to pick out what you think from the list that's there is the most and the least resource efficient option. So there are the two questions. So which is the most sustainable option and which is the least sustainable option? And we'll go to the Menti poll now. Go on, who's going first? Yep. So prevention is the hot favourite there, and that's in fact correct. So the best thing you can do in terms of the waste hierarchy is prevent the waste occurring in the first place. Now that is easier said than done, and we'll dig into that in a moment as we cover. But you then move into let's move into the next question for the least sustainable option. Before I give away all the answers. Very good. Okay, thanks for that. So a bit like in when they ask the audience, on the Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, the highest option is actually the correct option, and disposal is the least sustainable option in waste hierarchy. So what does disposal mean? Well, disposal means disposal in landfill. We have less landfills, they're expensive to operate, it's not considered a good way of managing resources, and you should only dispose of waste in landfill when you've completely run out of all other options. Many of your waste contractors will use the other recovery option, which you see as number 4 there, which is the next highest, and there you're looking into maybe pyrolysis or incineration in a controlled manner, where at least there is some energy recovery and maybe some generation of very, very low grade materials that come out of the waste treatment process. So that's kind of a good exercise, I think. So if we can just cut back to the main slides. Thank you. And there's the waste hierarchy as it looks. So you consider the waste hierarchy. Can you prevent the waste going into those skips in the first place? That could be complex, and you're going to have to do a lot of thinking to do that. If you can't do that, can you reuse the material without changing the integrity of it? So can you or who the organizations you're working with prepare that material for another use where value is going to be extracted from the material? So a good example would be reuse of building materials, where you've overordered building materials. Don't chuck them in the skip. Can someone else use them? Within the school, we've got a platform where materials that have been overordered, because this continues to happen, can be provided to community groups for their use, and that's a kind of a nice way of reusing materials. It's not efficient in terms of the obviously the ordering to site, but there is frequently a degree of over ordering, just as one example. Then comes recycling. Can the material be broken down for recycling? So a good example there would be plastic packaging. Provided you can segregate properly, that material can be recycled in the right way. Stuart on the chat makes a point that the triangle should be inverted so that the disposal at the tip at the bottom and the least material going to this end route. Yeah, good point, Stuart. I'll change that slide. Thank you for that. Then moving to other recovery that I spoke about, and then you move into disposal. So all I will say on the hierarchy is, if absolutely nothing else, try and ingrain that into your thinking. You know, what can you think in terms of an order of benefit, and what you can do with that order of benefit. So don't exclude that possibility. But something more, I suppose, a bit wider thinking is coming along, and that's called the circular economy. And I just want to talk about that because traditionally we have looked, and certainly as we've moved into kind of, you know, being good at manufacturing and having low value supply chains, having what we call a linear economy, where raw materials are grown or dug out of the ground. Something is designed from those raw materials. It's then manufactured. We then consume it, and then when we don't want it anymore, or something better comes along, or something newer comes along, we chuck it away and don't worry about the consequences. Well, that is one way of thinking about life. But as we know, and as some of us have probably found over the last 11 months, when you don't have that possibility to just go out and buy the things you want, you think about making the most of what you have, and it's amazing how far you can make it go. So imagine how far you could make it go if you focus that into the design stage. So the circular economy is about that. It's about thinking from the design stage onwards, right through the manufacture, consumption, and then maintenance cycle, into keeping resources and assets, everything you have, in use for as long as possible, as effectively as possible, and then being able to recover what's valuable from that at the end of that process. We've got a separate e-learning on this, which we're going to be running in a week or so. I'm sure that Sophie will be able to put that in the chat box for you. Yeah, good point from John there. Thanks, John, about existing market for potential customer or surplus materials. With a potential customer for surplus materials, absolutely there is, yes. So there's a definition for the circular economy that you can see, and it's quite a nice definition, really. It's nice and easy to understand. There's loads of stuff on the school site about the circular economy. You can find out more. So you're going to keep resources in use as long as possible, get the most from them while they're in use, and then recover and regenerate products and materials at the end of each service life. So this is now even moving to the stage of thinking about designing buildings for deconstruction, and certainly for maintenance. Just to show how this plays in, because that might all sound very highfalutin, it's not. So if for major developments in London, the London plan includes a requirement for those major construction projects to produce what I've seen and are extremely detailed circular economy statements explaining how the project itself will enable the building materials, the components, the products to be disassembled and reused. So you've got to think right from the start in that respect. The UK has its own circular economy strategy, which kind of leads on from the EU, a bit of a leaving present from the EU, but we've been doing our own thinking around circular economy, and that applies for all the home nations. The UK Environment Bill, which is due to come out pretty soon, sets a framework for increasing recycling, and there'll be legal powers banning the export of plastic waste to developing countries. So we're going to see things happen that are going to make us think more about how we manage our own material more effectively. And another key area there is extended producer responsibility, which you can see mentioned last of all. Okay, let's just think about the money, because it always helps to think about the money. As an industry, it depends whose estimates you believe, but there is evidence to suggest that we're still generating an absolutely colossal amount of waste. Now, a lot of that, of course, is around soils and materials of those, soils and aggregates, but it's still plenty and plenty of waste going into skips. We have a landfill tax, and when the landfill tax was brought in, it was always determined that the landfill tax would have increments added to it every year or so, and that's been happening. So it's currently now at £91 per tonne of waste that goes to landfill. So that's a tax just that goes to the exchequer for material that goes to landfill. A smaller figure for inert waste, but you can see the kind of the growth there, £64 into 2012-13 to where it's kind of moved on to, and will continue to move on to. But the landfill tax and the cost of waste, and indeed the cost of your skip, isn't the only issue. So if you're thinking true cost of waste, let's say an average 8-9 yard skip costs £300 from the company. There's evidence to suggest that, and it's good evidence to suggest, that the true cost of waste is much, much higher. In fact, could be heading towards £2,500. So why would that be? What are the things on the right-hand side of that seesaw? And we're now going to move to, I think, our final Menti poll. And if we can bring that one up. And we're going to ask, what are the other contributing factors to the true cost of waste? So thinking about that seesaw, what things, and you can name up to 3, so you can get a good bit of scope here. What things could contribute to the actual cost of waste? What is it costing your business, your organisation? Carbon, yeah. Yeah, so we can see how that's developing. There's a lot of issues there, and some real key ones. All that wasted labour, all that wasted time, all that transportation causing a nuisance, affecting air quality, affecting accessibility around site. The carbon impact, which is going to be oh so important and will need to be measured, and the cost of paying for that carbon. Just the process of disposal itself, the whole kind of process of waste management, the whole process of being involved in environmental management, it all takes time. So if you had less in the first place and a more controlled process, you would most certainly be saving money. The information I put up is sort of it's something that a company called AMEC that eventually were procured, bought by Morgan Sindall, produced years ago, and other organisations have looked at it since. Plenty of organisations have done skip dives and done costings, and one of our school partners, Zero Waste Scotland, has looked into this in quite a lot of depth, and they just did one assessment, like a detailed assessment of one skip at one stage in a house building project, and came up with a figure of around £2,500 very recently, and very, very keen on doing other kind of assessments around that. I've worked with other school partners in this area, and I know that school partners are doing fantastic work in this area. I can mention Red Row, who are doing work around looking at the materials that come from the build of one of their Oxford houses and comparing it from site to site and seeing how that varies. Really useful investigative work to actually get to the bottom of where materials are being wasted. Yeah, Kate's just put in the chat life cycle cost, and that kicks in as well. A really critical issue, the costs of disposal, and the reputational issue Barry mentions there. Really important. That if you demonstrate yourselves to be a wasteful business, you're not really demonstrating yourselves to be an efficient business. And let's face it, there will always be waste, but can we manage it more effectively? So thanks for that. You'll get copies of all this stuff, by the way, so you can use this stuff anywhere else you want to. So there are some of the answers that I stuck on the slide. So the waste management itself, and I think we covered all these. Storage, I can't remember if storage got a mention, but while you're storing waste on site, you're taking up a space where something else could be happening on that site, and it brings with it health and safety aspects as well. The damage of raw materials is a real key one. So many construction materials in particular get damaged on the way to site, and it's it's heartbreaking to see it, but you see it happen all the time. They might be weathered, and they end up going into the skips. They might get broken, they might get chipped, somebody might just forget about them, and they go out of date. This is what happens. wasted energy, wasted labour, wasted time, wasted money. So I hope that's helpful as a kind of quick resume there. Just in terms of what you can do in waste management and reduction, just going to show a few things here, and there are some people are already starting to come up with answers actually in the chat, which is brilliant. So we've got, you know, Thomas talking about doing a kind of cradle to grave analysis and actually take a proper look at the issue. If you've got a relatively repetitive process, it's not the hardest thing in the world to look at areas in which you can make that more efficient. So why would you bother with waste management planning at all? Well, several reasons, but here's 4 good ones. It is more resource efficient. You're going to reduce material wastage. You're going to actually reduce the amount of stuff that you use, which is going to reduce costs there. You're going to reduce fly tipping and nuisance, so you're going to have a cleaner, more effective site, and all that risk of reputational damage, which some of which we touched on before. You're going to reduce site accidents. It's going to be a safer site. Yeah, I see Mariam's put in lean as an example. Now, I want to mention that the school is opening up a whole new area around lean and lean techniques, and resource management is a kind of key area to play into the lean debate, because the principles of lean you can transport anywhere, you can take anywhere and apply them to your process. So as John says there, you know, putting in a waste audit at the start, at the end of your project would be a good starting point. So look at the start, look at the end, and set your baselines. Why not? Always start at the prevention end of the hierarchy. Just, you know, when we consider that, just think what can we reduce. We're currently engaged in a project with the homes industry and some homes industry partners. 3, we're working with Bellway Homes, we're working with Taylor Wimpey, and we're working with Barrett, and we're focusing on packaging that comes from some of the key suppliers to those organisations, and getting an understanding of what the types of packaging are that are delivered to site. So once you've done that, you can work out the amount of material, if you want to call it that is actually going to arrive on site that could end up as waste, or could be repatriated, could be designed out. Lots and lots of options there. But before you even start, you have to set the baseline, and it's kind of fascinating work. And the whole built environment as an industry has not been as good as it should be in this area, and it's areas where we can really work. So we're seeing lots of good stuff coming in the chat there about lean, measuring and targeting. Yes, smart waste, Stuart, great one to use in terms of measuring and targeting site waste. Removing the non-value adding activities. Yeah, low embodied energy materials as well. Yeah, so actually reduce the carbon in those materials. So I think, you know, some great thinking coming through already, just there. But think at every stage, but don't just throw out these stages and go for the recycling or other recovery area, let alone the disposal area. Try and think about, can you prevent, can you prepare for reuse before you get to that stage. So let's look at some examples here, and you know, great to see the chat still coming in. But at the prevention end, value engineering is a key one. So can you value engineer your process? Can you kind of really think about what you're going to design out, what you don't need? Great point was made there. Can you prefabricate? Certainly, you know, we're heavily involved within the school in offsite as well. And can offsite technologies be brought to the fore a little bit more, so that you can actually move from a traditional construction or FM type process to more of a manufacturing process? We're seeing a lot of activity with this around areas such as M&E, for instance, you know, areas you might not think of, where you can have a degree of prefabrication and really get a control around the packaging and the waste materials. So it's good to see. Can you just design to standard sizes? If you see that same bit of dry lining being sliced off every time, ask yourself the reason why. Is there a way to redesign the units that you're building? Is there a way to get a different size from the manufacturer? And can you plan? Can you just have good works planning so that materials arrive in time, intact and undamaged, and all get used, or as many get used as possible? So all those areas are strong areas in which you can delve. I shall just have a drink. Thank you. And talk about preparing for reuse. So I've got no doubt that you'll see some of these examples coming into play. Use of on-site aggregate crushers is certainly something that's come through. Pallet take-back schemes, quite a wide uptake. You know, we shouldn't be in a world really where we've got broken old pallets hanging around construction sites or FM clients' premises, cluttering up the place and causing a hazard. We should be able to do better than that. Can you work with third-party organisations to help on this? So can you work with social enterprise schemes locally that can get involved in this in terms of the reuse, particularly around materials that you know, you did, despite best efforts, you did over order them. You've got that extra timber, you've got those extra bricks, you've got that extra plaster. That can be used for training somewhere. That can be used effectively in communities, and you can get a good story from that as well. Yeah, I think that's true, John. What you put in the chat there. Thank you. Can you use stuff on other projects? You know, is there a way of in terms of logistics of appreciate this isn't always the easiest thing to do, and the king on certainly on any construction site will always probably be the program, maintaining the program. So things that interfere with the program tend not to get as much attention as they might always potentially deserve. But a thought at the start on how those things could work can really help. Okay, let's move on a little bit more. Okay, in terms of recycling, it's very obvious stuff. Have an inert skip, have specific segregation for plasterboard, which you really need to anyway, but make sure you're actually doing it. Make sure that waste segregation is aggregate, or in fact, even the phrase of waste segregation, I should change that, because we should be talking about materials. We're going to see significant changes, I think, in the next year, 2, 3, around how we treat our resources, because the value of them is going to go up, and the ability to have kind of transborder movements of materials that are waste is going to lessen. There's going to be less of a business case for doing it. It's going to be more troublesome to do so, and we're going to be thinking about how we can actually get more value from those materials. So if you get to something massively complicated like plastics, or potentially massively complicated like plastics, you've got to think it through from the start. What are the streams you're going to be working with? How can you segregate them out? Yeah. Thanks for that, Melanie. So just thinking about value in the widest sense as well across the whole board, and making sure that we achieve that wherever we can. Okie doke, I'm going to move on. One more. So there are things that we can do. And that's the good news. There's tons of things we can do. It's not like we're stuck with this problem. We can be more efficient. We work across the built environment in traditionally quite low margin industries. The margins are not high, and the difference between success and failure can be quite small. So any of these savings that can be made, any of these efficiencies that can be made, can save money as well as improving the reputation, and obviously going towards the sustainability targets. So there's loads of good stuff out there on waste management planning. It is not a legal obligation as we stand to have a site waste management plan. Somebody thought it was a good idea to kind of remove that legal obligation. I would suggest that was a bad idea at the time, but I would urge anybody who's got a significant project to plan at the start, put in place a site waste management plan and make it work, and just get a bit of training. There's loads of free training on the school. There is absolutely tons of it. Make use of it, and if you don't use our free training, use somebody else's. Just get some knowledge in there, and talk to your suppliers as well, because your suppliers will have the knowledge. Okay, so housekeeping is absolutely critical, and kind of comes to one of the most fundamental areas of effective waste management planning, which is around health and safety. So plan for efficient handling of those materials, set some indicative targets. We're involved in quite repetitive actions, so we ought to be able to get a feel for the kinds of things that are happening, and plan as early as possible. I know it's difficult because the team isn't always in place that can do the planning at the time when you want to do the planning. They're probably working on a different project or somewhere else, but we've got very used to picking up the phone and using Zoom just lately. So I would suggest that we don't have to have people driving around from site to site to get involved in a 20-minute meeting on what could we do to make things better. So that, that would be a tip I would suggest, just to allow that time and learn from what we already know. And measure. This is one of the areas where we tend to be the weakest in terms of understanding the quantities, understanding target versus actual, or the kind of review side of things, and also in sharing success. Sharing what's been done. Share good news stories. Get them out there. It's vitally important to do so. Okie doke. And then in terms of review, it's just around these kind of areas. So your lessons learned, sharing the learning. Remember to do this. We know that we work in incredibly busy industries, and it's probably on to the next project most of the time, without time to think about the project that's just finished. But if those lessons can be shared, then benefits will arrive. And it's the only way we're going to hit our targets, to be quite honest. And some of the big enemies: keep an eye on over-ordering. Think about over-ordering, find ways to minimize that process. But if over-ordering occurs, make sure that reuse is the option and not disposal or recycling. Think about packaging. We're going to have a big focus around packaging. We've got the plastic packaging tax, which is going to kick in this time next year. That will apply a tax of £200 per tonne to any plastic packaging manufactured or imported that does not have at least a 30% recycled content, and that is quite a mouthful. We've got lots of additional content on that area, but suppliers who have primary packaging and transportation packaging, secondary packaging, will need to be really starting to think about that in terms of the plastic side of things. Think about materials handling, so that materials get looked after properly, don't get broken. Just think generally about wasteful practices. Hope these things are useful. And that's really it from me. Just to say that, we do need to move towards a more circular model. You will see the phrase circular economy come into kind of common speech and common parlance a lot more over the next couple of years. So, get to grips with it, what it means. Get to grips with the waste hierarchy and making use of it. Those are the areas I would urge you to focus on. That's really it for me. I'd urge you to do the feedback, but if you've got any other questions, let's see them. Is over-ordering a greater risk post-Brexit? Great question. I do wonder, actually, because when we think about it, it cuts both ways, doesn't it? We've got the whole supply chain security and resilience issue. Do we need to order enough to make sure we don't run out? But do we order too much so it goes off date? It just requires our industry to be better than ever at what it does, and look after itself, look after its materials, because there's no point. At home you would go mad if you had a fridge full of food that you chucked out because it had gone off date. So apply that to the workplace. It's no different, really. Fitness for use is absolutely critical. Any more questions? I'm just showing here while we're talking some school resources that are there. We've got two great e-learning modules, one on introduction to waste around kind of more traditional construction environments, and there's a second one around introduction to waste around FM environments. You can find them both on the school. We've got a map of the materials exchange platforms, which shows where they are near to you. How do we make sure and enforce waste prevention across our supply chain? What a question. You just keep asking the questions, Mariam. That's all you can do, because you need a resource efficient supply chain as well. That should be part of your procurement process when you set up with organizations, but also part of the kind of contracts management process. Be constantly talking to them about what they're doing with their packaging. I would suggest that's a real key area of focus, because any organization worth its salt will be focusing on adjusting its packaging to be fit for purpose, but at the same time as minimal as possible. And we're there. Thanks, Mark, because we've hit bang on 13:45. I should leave on a high, really. But yeah, I hope that's helpful. Use the stuff on the school. Give us some feedback. Whistle Stop Tour. There we go. Thank you.